Hey there dreamers, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going over how we can build a tactics, grid-based, turn-based movement type system like this. If you've ever played XCOM or Into the Breach or Final Fantasy Tactics, this should look very familiar to you. It's pretty easy to set up, and I'm going over it right now, so if you're interested in learning, stick around. Okay, so to get started, I've built a tile here, and I'll just go over how I made it really quickly. It's very easy. I just set down a block like this, and I used the stretch tool to stretch it out so that it was 1 by 1 in the X and Z directions like this. And we can pop it down like that. So that's exactly how this is, and then I've just spray painted on top of it. So this is the actual original color here, and you can see we don't have any tint or anything. It's just spray paint. So very easy to set up. Now we can get out a little character. Go ahead and use these small guys that fit nicely on these 1 by 1 tiles. Go ahead and shrink the head just because I think the big head looks ridiculous. Okay, so now we can get into the meat and potatoes of this. Now I know what you may be thinking. I don't eat meat. I don't want to get into the meat. That's okay. That's just an expression. We can still do this with or without meat, I promise. Okay, so let's get rid of pretty much everything in here. I'm going to get rid of the sliding behavior, the level complete, the follow behavior. I'm going to leave the poses because we're going to want these to activate when the player is moving or when the character is moving. So we'll leave those. And inside of the controller logic, we can get rid of pretty much all of this stuff. Now, we could even get rid of this controller sensor and abstract it out. If you had a bunch of players, you may not want to have a bunch of controller sensors, but for the purposes of this, it's going to be just fine. Now I'm going to set this to remote controllable because we don't want to possess the character and we want our imp around. You could set it as possessible with the imp, but remote controllable will work. So I'm going to get out a microchip to hold the majority of our players' logic here. And this is going to take in a couple of buttons. So let's go ahead and get some nodes. And we're going to be using the X button here. And we're also going to be using the circle button. The X button is what we'll use to select the character, and circle will be used to deselect anything that we've already selected. We're going to want these signals coming in to be pulses, so I'm going to get out a signal manipulator and I'll set it to pulse. And so I'll just copy that down, and those will go in there like that. Now these things are going to be controlling the state of the character. So by default, we'll be in the A state, which just means that they're not selected, there's nothing happening, and there's going to be 3 total states. So this A state is going to be deselected, nothing. The B state is when we've selected the character, and the C state, for now, will just be movement. So with that being said, that means we're going to need to have some logic that changes states here. So I'll get out a couple more nodes into a microchip. We'll go ahead and fill in this logic as it happens, but this will go in here, and that will go in there. Now one of these will take us into the C state, and the other one will take us back to the A state. Now we're going to want to know when the player highlights the character so that when they press X, it can switch to the state, the B state, the selected state. So I'm going to get out an AND gate here, and I'm also going to get out a grab sensor. The grab sensor has a hovered output, and by default all the pieces on the puppet are collidable with the imp, which means it can detect when it's hovering on the player. So with that being said, if it's hovered and we press the X button, then we want to switch to the B state. And now we're going to need another AND gate because we want to be able to cancel the selection by pressing circle. Now we don't want to be able to cancel in the middle of movement, and we can do it from A, that's not really a big deal. So it's either that we press circle and we're not in C, or we press circle and we're in B. So I will use that since it's one less gadget to use. And that will go into the A state. I'll just get a number displayer out so we can view the state. So by default, we're in state 0. If if I select the character by highlighting it and pressing X, we're now in the B state. And if we press circle, we go back to the 0 state, the A state. Now seems like a good time to go over some of the tile logic here. So the tiles aren't going to be just sculpts, they're going to have some logic on them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out a tag because we want to know the position of the tile. And I'm just going to place it right there in the center, but on top. Okay? And we don't need to label this because we're just going to be using the position. And since we're using the position, I'll go ahead and split this. Okay, and now we're also going to need to know when this thing is being detected. So I'm going to give that the label of scenery. I must have forgotten to do that earlier. And I'm going to plug the detected into here. And now we want this tile to be grabbable. Okay, not just collidable, but grabbable. That way, when we select the character, we can press R2 on the tile to select it. Now, because it's not movable, you don't have to worry about the player being able to grab it and move it around. So, you know, it's stable. But this way, they can press R2 to select the tile. So since we're going to have to worry about that, let's get out a grab sensor. Now we want to be able to get the position from this tile when the player chooses it. So I'm going to pass it through a wireless transmitter. And I'll just call this selected tile. So the only thing that ever comes through this transmitter is when the tile is being selected. So that means we're going to have some sort of condition to turn this on. Now the condition is fairly simple. It's if we grab it and it's being detected, then that means this is the selected tile. And now we can work on a little bit of the visual stuff here. So because I spray painted this thing, the hue cycle doesn't really do anything. And if I tint, we can see that's kind of nice. That kind of gives a highlighted look. So we can use some tint for the highlight, meaning maybe we can move there. And then on top of that, if we're hovering over it with our imp, maybe we'll add a little bit of glow. Before this gets out of hand, I'm going to put this all into another microchip. So one of these will be for being highlighted, and the other one will be for the glow. So I'll just plug this into there like that, and that into there. And I'm going to move everything into this chip. So I'm going to unplug that and bring this in. Okay, so this is now the detected. There we go. So that'll do that. So if it's ever detected, that means that this is a tile we should be able to go to. So I'll plug the detected straight into there. And that way, if it's ever detected, it'll automatically highlight. Now there's another thing, which is the glow. And that's if we're hovering over it and it's detected. So I'll get out one more AND gate. So if it's detected and we hover with the imp, then we'll make it glow. Now obviously it's not being detected right now, but let's see how this looks if we fake it. So I'll get out a switch, I'll plug that into there. So we can see this is what the tile will look like when we can move there, and if you highlight, then it'll kind of glow a little bit extra. In order to save thermo, we can also turn off the tag when it's not being detected, right? So if we plug the detected into the power of the tag, then we don't have to worry about, too many tags being on at a time, because it'll only be on if it's being detected. Okay, so that's all of this done. And there's actually one other thing I want to do, and that is if we're on a tile, we shouldn't be able to move there, and if any other player is on a tile, or an enemy or whatever is on a tile, we shouldn't be able to move onto that tile either. I mean, you could have a game like that where you can have multiple units on the same tile, but if we wanted to prevent that, we can do something else. So what I'll do is I'll get out another tag, and I'll call this taken. And this will signal whether or not this tile is taken. So I'm just going to move this right into the center, just like the other one. And what we'll do is if it's not detected, meaning the tile is not taken, then we can power this microchip. Okay, so in order to make that work, inside of our puppet, we can just put a little trigger zone here. And this will look for that tag called taken. We'll just use a circle, we'll make it really small. Like that. Okay, so if the player is on the tile, then this logic won't happen. None of this can happen, right? You can't select the tile. There's no reason to highlight it, all that stuff. Now is a good time to go over how we're going to actually have tiles become selected. So I'll just go ahead and copy some of these out so that we can have a nice little board to use here. In order to get this to happen, we're going to have to use trigger zones. Now the way you set up your trigger zones is completely up to preference here. There's a couple different ways we could do it. So I'll go ahead and move them into the center of the board here just so we can, you know, use them as measurements here. So this is going to look for the label of scenery. So it's up to you how you want to set these up, but I'll go over how I set them up. So I'm going to shrink all of this like this, okay? I'm just going to make it so that we can move 2 spaces manually like this. So I've set it to 4 in this direction, and so that will detect 2 ahead and 2 behind, okay? And so we could copy this over, and this one will just move over to the right like so, and we'll make it smaller. So bring this down to 2, and then we can copy it over one more time here like so, and this will just be much smaller like that, and then we can just copy these like that. So then we can bring this trigger zone onto the other side like so. Okay, so here we can see that those tiles are selected, right? So if we only want that to happen when we're in the B state, then we just plug the power in like that. So now we can see when we select the character, those become highlighted because we can move to them. And when we highlight over these tiles with our imp, it glows a little bit. So for a movement pattern like this works great. If you only want your character to be able to move forwards and sideways, then you could get rid of most of these and just have 2, one that would go this way and one that would go that way. Cool, so with all that, pretty much the only thing we have left to do now is to set up the movement. I'm going to go ahead and color this green so that I can remember that there's trigger zones in here. And we'll get out another chip, and this is going to be for the movement. In order to move to a specific location, a follower is a great gadget to use. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the grid so I can see. So let's get a follower out, and let's make sure that the gizmo is at the base of our feet here. So I'll get the grid back on, of course, because I can never not have the grid on. Okay, so now I can turn the grid off. We want this to be at the feet because remember the tags are right at the top of each of these things. So if we're moving to a location, we want to have the player move from this point here, right? Okay. So I'll turn this up and we can set the speed whatever we want. It doesn't really matter. And what we're going to be using is this target position. Let's get out a combiner. And we'll set it to 3 numbers and we'll plug that in to the target position. Cool. Since we're going to have a bunch of different characters, potentially, let's go ahead and use calculators like this, which are often referred to as local variables. If you saw my other grid-based movement system, I used a variable, but I don't want to have an X and Z variable for every single character, because that would eat up a bunch of variables and it would be kind of a pain to set up for all of them. So let's use this. If you're not familiar with how this works, the equal sign goes into the B port here. And what this does is if there's ever some sort of number that comes in, let's say a 1 comes into the A port, the 1 goes into the A port, so 1 plus 0 equals 1. And that result goes into B. So now this thing is holding the value of 1. If we get another pulse, then we can see it goes to 2. right? So this is a great way to hold on to a value as long as everything going in is pulsed in. Now in order to override this value, say we're at 4 here and we want to move to the value of 7. So say we have some sort of value of 7 coming in somehow. We want to take the value of 7 and we'll subtract this value, right? So we'll do a subtraction, and that will be powered by something else, and that would go back into A. So you can see we're at 4 here, and now we want to change it to the value of 7. So if you turn this switch on a pulse, 7 minus 4 is then going to go into A. So we turn that on, and now we have 7 as our number. Right, so we essentially cleared the value and then set it to something else. If you just wanted to clear the value, then you could plug this into the B port, so that makes it a negative number, and the same thing would happen. So let's take a look at the value here. We're at 9, and if I turn this on, that sets it to 0 because it passed a negative 9 in, so negative 9 plus 9 is 0. Okay. So this is how we're going to use our movement stuff here. Now one thing to note is that these start with a value of 0. So if the follower is on, then the character is going to try and run to 0, 0, 0 because that's what's going into the follower. So in order to get the starting position, we're going to have to send the initial positions in. So I'm going to get this out. And this is only going to happen at the very beginning. So I'll call this init, which is short for initialize. And in here, we're just going to have a tag, which is going to go at the player's feet. So we'll split this position, and we'll split that as well. Because we don't really care about the Y position, although we could care about it if we wanted to, but for this example I'm not going to. And so we'll get these out and we'll plug these into these outgoing nodes. And those nodes, this one will go into X and this one will go into the Z value, right? Now we need to be careful here. You can see that it's constantly climbing, so this only needs to happen once on a pulse. So I'll get a timer out, and the pulse will power this. So I'll set this value to be 1 frame. You could use a timeline for this as well if you wanted. So now we can see that the values start at 0 here, and when we start time, the value gets set to 4, 6, and the player doesn't move because that's the value being plugged into the follower. Now if you wanted to, you could, when this is not done, then we can power this chip so that way it turns off right at the beginning. Totally up to you how you want to set that up. You could have this be outside of the actual chip here, but still grouped with the character, and then have it delete itself. Whatever you'd like to do is totally fine. And now we can get into the rest of the movement. You'll remember that on these things we're sending a value through selected tile. So now we can go ahead and use this. So let's get out a wireless receiver, which will listen for selected tile. We'll make it scene wide. And we know this is a position, so we'll split it. One little tip here, you can see there's only 2, so if we get out a combiner and plug that in, now we can use these values to set up the rest of our logic here. So I'm going to get out a couple nodes. I'll make them have no port, like that. There we go, and those will plug in there. So these are going to be powered when we get a signal. So now I can unplug that, and I'll get a signal manipulator, and this will come in here and set a pulse. And now this is why I moved everything off and away from the origin, because if we're getting a value of 0, 0, this is not going to send a pulse, and it's not going to output a pulse either. So with positive values, there will always be a pulse that comes through this. Now the reason we need a pulse is exactly what I showed before. So we'll get these out. Those will go into here, and this is what's going to go into the calculator, but we need to subtract what's inside of these currently because we're overriding the value. So I'll set both of these to subtract, and this one will go into the A port of that one, this one will go into the A port of this one, and these will only be powered when we get a signal from the wireless receiver. Okay, so we can see it starts, and if we ever got a value of like a different tile, those values would come in here and overwrite the values inside the calculator, which would then make the follower move. So we can see if we select the character and then we select this, the character will move to that spot. Pretty cool, right? Now this is fairly ugly. Let me see if I can clean this up a little bit, because this is gross. Okay, so that's a little bit better, not by much, but whatever, it works, right? Okay, so this is how our movement works. Now we want to take note that we only want this to happen if this player is selected, right? Now if we copied this player character out, right, now we have two of them, there's going to be a problem here. So I can select this one, and now they both move there, right? That's not right. This is a very easy fix for this. I'll get out this node and I'll plug that into the power of the receiver, and that will only be active if the player is selected. Now we can copy this player over, and we can see we can select one and move them, and only that one moves, right? Now you can see that it stays selected, so maybe we want it to deselect once we start moving, and now we can get into what this is for. So what we can do is we'll get out a movement sensor here, and so this is for B, so I'll label this one selected, and I'll label this other one moving. Now I'll label this move, and I'll label this one deselect. Okay, so if we're in the B state and we start to move, then we want to switch this to the C state. So we could use an AND gate like this. So B like that. Right, that's kind of faking it a little bit, but that's okay with me. And if we're moving, or we're in the moving state, but our character is no longer moving, then we want to go back to the A state. So if this is equal to 0 and we're moving, then we can deselect the character. We can see we're in state A. If I select, we're in B. If I press circle, we go back to A. Now if I choose a spot to move, it will go to C until it's done moving, and then it switches back to A. This way the highlight selection stuff is gone and we can't click anything else while it's moving. Now I do want to bring something else up here, and it has to do with the way we set up the trigger zones. As of right now, this is one trigger zone, and this is another one, and this is another one, right? And I set that up that way just for ease. Now if you were making a tactics game like this, you may want the ability to have the enemies block off your paths. So you can see I'm right in front of the enemy, and you may not want to be able to move past the enemy or through the enemy's location, right? So if that were the case, you would need to set up the trigger zone so that there was one in each kind of cardinal direction based off, you know, whatever distance metric you'd like, and you would have to do a little bit extra to get the keyframes or the trigger zones to work. So over here I've set up a little example of this. You can see here's the enemy, here's the player. All the blue ones are the ones we can move to, and as the enemy gets in the way of the path, the path gets shorter. So you can see that normally you'd be able to move all the way over here, but you can't because there's an enemy in the way. And so the way I did this was with a trigger zone, just like we have, and with a laser scope, which is looking for the foe with a fall off. Not the normal range, but a fall off, because this can give us a percentage of hit, right? And that percentage of hit can blend between two keyframes. So if I unplug this, we can see that these keyframes, this one is the full size of the trigger zone, and this one is all the way back at the player. And you can see if I play, you can see the zone shrinking there. So if we use the hit percentage in like that, then we can block off the path for this trigger zone. So the closer it is, the closer the enemy is to the player, then the less distance we can move. We're only able to move up to the enemy. Okay? So I thought I'd toss this out here as a potential workaround for something like this if you cared about that type of behavior. I'm not going to go in depth and make that for all the characters, just because I feel like that would add to the length of the video, but I thought I'd toss this out here as a hint as to how you could go about getting that done. And so that's pretty much everything there is to this movement system that I made here. Obviously, you can go a lot further with this. If you were to decide that you could move into the same space, you could still have that work. This doesn't cover how to deal with enemies. However, it would prevent you from moving onto a space with an enemy as long as they had a trigger zone of their own detecting the tile beneath them. In any case, I hope this was helpful to anyone trying to make a tactics turn-based movement system like this. If I helped you out, please let me know. If you enjoyed this, let me know. I'd love to read your feedback in the comments. If you're new around here and you want to see more videos, go ahead, click subscribe if you feel like it. I got a lot of cool stuff coming out all the time. I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe. I'll see you next time.